I think next we have a quick panel discussion around MCP, use cases, challenges in production. I think we have Rohit. I think we can just pull the chair.
But yeah, we can have a quick discussion on MCP. Are you folks using MCP in production right now? Yeah. What MCP servers are you using? Kubernetes MCP. Okay.
What's the biggest use case for that? Is it spinning up new clusters, managing existing?
Usually around infra provisioning and also development. Yeah.
Any GitHub MCP tools?
Yeah, that would be. I guess I have a question. What do you think about so MCP servers? Yes, they should be remote. No one should use local MCP servers that they run on there. And what do you think about remote MCP clients? Because that's actually the next question. Because that's a MCP client today. So it's not bad, you weren't able to have a complex application, and then you work on all the local MCP clients. And what I think with remote MCP client, because that's where this is going, because actually OpenAI response, request. Response is not one, it's really remote MCP client. But it's provide tools and meetings and good stuff, the constant agent.
So I think this is almost part of that shift left strategy with most AI providers, where they're like, hey, the chat completions endpoint is fairly restrictive. How can we do a little bit more? Which is, and the chat completions endpoint, if you remember the first time it came out, seemed magical, right? I don't need to do token by token response anymore. I don't have to manage those responses. It's already in a chat format, etc. Which was an abstraction over the tokenized, the token-based LLMs that already exist. I think this is another abstraction over where this will almost become standard, where you're now making requests to agentic endpoints managed by AI providers. So I think that is almost an inevitable future where MCP servers get connected into AI providers, or I mean, that's what even Porky is doing now with MCP connectors. And even other applications, we'll see a lot more of this where MCP servers are getting baked into the chat completions agent directions.
I have a question for Mohan. You look at that architectural diagram where there's a lot of LLMs and data stores in there and AI gateway center, but where are you currently, or you already have an MCP strategy, and you already started building MCP servers?
Yeah, so MCP I think is a fantastic. So like everybody who tried to learn generative AI, and became very curious to start developing an application. When MCP came, everybody wanted to start with MCP. But the like I said, is more into making sure that the environment is secure. It became an issue like a supply chain. Can I trust that the MCP server I'm start using from third party? Can I trust? They didn't bring any visibility into my environment. So that's what the biggest difference. But yes, our developers, they started studying into the MCP servers and what they do. So what we are focusing right now, the use case we are building our MCP server. So that's what we are doing right now. But if you want to start using, third-party applications, you want to do it to supply chain assessment.
So when you say evaluations are important and security obviously important, interesting to know from your because Prisma Air is getting very popular, but it's more on the innocent side. We already have started working or have thoughts on, are there going to be guardrails for MCPs, and yes, and how do they look like?
Yes. So we're doing a couple things in this space with regards to MCP. So when platforms offer a deterministic way of hooking into MCP, we can be there with our API intercept. So we can do a pre-tool scan and a post-tool scan. So we can also do a prompt before it gets to the LLM and triggers those tools, and the response as well. So typically with the LLM sandwich that you're familiar with, we can also do that with each tool call as well, pending that the platform that you're building your MCP in has that ability. So Porky does with the MCP gateway, code, for example, hooks that we can also use. So we can scan the pre and post tool use. For example, the reason I brought up GitHub is it's a very common MCP tool where you can potentially pull malicious code, or there's a malicious URL within the repository, potentially even a prompt injection, right? That if the LLM completed, essentially nefarious things would happen. So we can do the prompt scan, pre-tool use scan, post-tool use scan, and then response scan as well.
I mean, isn't there any concerns of when you have to do this pre-tool and post-tool scan, and you would maybe get access to any data, because that MCP gateway or rollout has access to execute those tools as well. So, I mean, that auth is present in the gateway. So, will you be able to do these pre-tool and pre-scans and post-scans without actually getting into pulling the context, or it's more about just the tool definition?
So the only time we get the context is actually in the posting scan. So when you say GitHub fetch me this repository, we pretty much just see the GitHub URL. So, okay, does that look malicious or not? That's roughly the only thing we're looking at. Now when it comes back down with the readme all the file contents, yes, we're seeing everything. As with your LLMs, as we so it's fully in line. We see pretty much everything that the LLM would see, unless Prisma Errors would block it. Part of the chain.
Coming back to that gateway thing, so it's very weird to ask questions like you like this, but when we have this routing strategy that's very when we talk about reliability, do you folks see these things happening in MCP as well? There's a primary stack MCP server that goes down to the, you can fall back to some other MCP server. Is that something that would happen?
I think not for, I would imagine maybe not for servers like Slack or GitHub, because those are single services. But I can imagine there's like high availability when you're hosting your own MCP servers. I mean, I'm sure when PJ is building their own servers and you're deploying it, you might want to have some amount of availability across those servers. And how can you sort of fall back or load balance across them? So that might be one of those things. But I'm guessing MCP servers are more about how do I connect proprietary data sources to my LLM requests more effectively. So an MCP itself is becoming this nice agent where a lot of the AI agents are just, that I'm seeing at least in production, are just becoming LLM calls, tool call, LLM call, and then answer. And that tool call is just an MCP powered tool call, which makes my agent just maybe 6 times if I've written my servers correctly. But yeah, I mean, if you've got more stuff to add.
I think you probably remember my initial discussion with you whenever I was talking about like how we can connect to data. So in my architecture, the platform architecture, I will talk about how to connect any data wherever it is. So MCP is providing the way we can connect. And when I was asking about routing to other MCP server, so it would have like just like LLMs. Right? Someone in my team asked me a question, how do we tackle with the scaling, right? Because if I'm using an Anthropic LLM from Bedrock itself provides some rating, right? So even though I have like 10 accounts, from the same reason doesn't give me any benefit because the Bedrock limited is per account and there is only one endpoint in the reason. Right? Now, Anthropic being available on Azure Foundry also, they announced today, right? So if that's the case, then in my application, using AI Gateway, I can build the fallback to Azure Anthropic one, right? So that gives me more resiliency in my architecture. Same way I'm thinking of an MCP server too. Right? So my data source could be in Azure, could be in AWS. Maybe down the line I'm keeping a copy in my multi-cloud environment where I'm thinking about more resiliency. It's the same data set which is required in the application hosted in Azure. Somewhere I'm moving the data, even though I'm not very fond of moving the data, but for some reason I'm doing it, and my application requires in Azure. So I should have a way to see the provider option, right? It is more like, I don't think it's like a very regular use case, but it could become very good use case in terms of thinking about resiliency, overall resiliency for the application.
Rohit, was that a big value proposition for your team in the early days as well, and still to this day, in terms of fall back to a different element, test one versus the other on the same call via the same application, and see the difference in output and performance?
Absolutely. I mean, imagine when GPT-5 launches, can you test GPT-5 on 5% of the traffic and then roll it out to?
That's A/B testing you can do. Yeah.
So we are already doing that.
Yes.
So one good example is LLM as a judge, right? Where the team is using Cohere for embedding, then they are using Nova for LLM judge. The main model is Claude. So it's already there. Now, when I was talking like one application probably you won't see, but if you are building a very complex application, you might find that, but I was talking about the cost as well. We all know that nobody is, cost effective right now, right? So maybe if my answer can get out of nowhere, and I want to build that. Maybe one portion of my application is better working with Nova, other portion of my application is better suited for cloud, maybe down the line Grok or some other model. So I have that choice. I'm not just stuck with one LLM. So that's a kind of framework, there's a kind of mindset I'm using, so that they are free of thinking about I'm just stuck with one model, and which is actually happening right now. So one organization in our, we have access to OpenAI model, and there are some use cases that are coming in where they think that OpenAI model is not providing the solution, the right solution they're looking for. Now they're just stuck because they did not have a way of connecting to another LLM. Now I'm working with the team, and they're trying to see if we can connect to the code key, and I can be more options. Now try with any LLM that you want. For it could be anything, I don't care. Which one you like, right? You like Power Automate, you like Founder. But if you are going to get onto the backend, you have a bunch of LLMs and you can try your answer.
From a pure question, very curious to understand from a pure networking lens, do you see MCPs very different from regular REST APIs? Like, do you feel that the whole networking has to bring in few newer components or new ways of connecting? And if, let's say, all the communications or all the data exchanges are happening over the same protocol and REST APIs, I mean, it's still working on the same, more or less same protocol, but do you see any changes that happening with Palo Alto?
It's an interesting question. I think from a network perspective, nothing's really changed, right? You can't reach those REST APIs regardless. You won't be able to in an MCP fashion. So I think that kind of remains the same. I like to think of MCPs as a wrapper around REST. That's really just it. And you can choose which ones are available, which ones are not, which is, in my opinion, from a security perspective, a godsend from an MCP implementation perspective, right? You don't give access to all of Slack or all of Jira, just the API points that user needs, etc. So I think in some ways, MCP allows for a scoping of API endpoints that a typical API token would not within most RBAC controls. Right? A lot of SaaS applications will give you 5 or 6 default roles and that have various sets of permissions and APIs that you can call.
But don't you think it's the same thing? Like,
Correct.
whoever wrote that API with RBAC is mostly going to write an MCP server, mostly be a wrapper of those APIs in some way.
Yes, but within the MCP context, you can still pare it down. So you can have the admin credential basically call the LLM and say, I want to make this tool call out to Prisma or Palo Alto. But if only 5 API endpoints are available, you won't be able to add users, even if you're an admin, you have the admin level credential, if that API is not available to you through MCP. So I think MCP actually provides, in some ways, a layer of security that isn't really thought about a lot in terms of paring down REST API endpoints to just what that an LLM should be able to do with it. Because there's likely a lot of administrative API endpoints that that a lot of organizations might not be comfortable with an LLM to carry out.
What tools to expose gives you that additional layer of response? You may not want to, expose all the tools. Like if you have 100 REST APIs, you don't create one-on-one tools for them, but you can just have maybe 10 tools that are exposed.
Yes, and obviously with remote MCP servers, that is not up to us, that is up to the vendor. But for any self-hosted implementation, that I think is an approach that a lot of organizations, we're seeing some organizations take that approach, paring down what would be available out of all of their set of API endpoints it's a very small subset of what they're allowing to MCP.
See, that another, I don't know whether we have a solution, but so I think like if my MCP is connecting to a database, right? So I'm more look likely think about like it's like a JDBC or ODBC connection that is providing a way to connect to the database. But now within my database, my data sets, the authorization to my data set, it depends on what you use. You know, I might have access to all the data, but then other person, because I'm talking about the PI data or the secret data, there might be certain individuals, they will have access to that and others may not. So at the MCP level, when we make the connection, it's all there, we have guardrails and way. But when it comes to individual data set, that's a permission level. I think most of the organizations, even pretty busy and are not really very comfortable to open MCP to like all the individuals. Because if I build my identity AI application, my AI agent, one agent will work on the you, one got me, one got you, and we all three have different versions. And we don't want to expose the data to the within the order I'm talking about, right? To the person who is not authorized to see it.
Yeah, the identity and permission set problem is a very interesting one that customers obviously ask security vendors about all the time. It depends on the application. Like, do you want your agent to have full scope to your Salesforce database and then get pared down based on the user calling it? Or should the agent have basically no access whatsoever and only on behalf of delegated by the user? It really depends on the organization's appetite, what the data set you're accessing is. But we're seeing both of those patterns emerge.
We talked about security and access control around MCP and what you mentioned. Co-networking there remains more or less same. But do you see any changes on the other side of things, like the telemetry, monitoring, when it comes to MCPs?
I think we're seeing it become a little more complex. You have agents that are now branching into MCP servers, MCP servers themselves calling LLMs back, requesting for data. So monitoring an agent run with MCP servers and AI models is definitely becoming messy. So I think I'm sure there's more interfaces that evolve that let developers like us to view how my agent ran. When did it pause? When did it ask for human input? And then how did it finally arrive at an answer? I think that's going to be interesting. It's no longer a linear or a hierarchical flow of data. We're seeing all sorts of things, and obviously that's something that we've still not solved at Portkey, but it'll be interesting to see what is this newer interface for this multi-turn agentic conversation with humans and computers.
I think it becomes a lot more interesting when you see an agent session also has its own temporary memory, and then the outputs and verdicts from these guardrails play a big role on how it is going to branch further or which route it's going to take. I think the telemetry for all of this, something still needs to be solved. Awesome. Any questions from the audience, please?
Yeah, it's like another question. Like, I think I'm discussion like agent to agent. What do you think? Is it MCP? Is it API? Is it something else?
Well, it could be H2A.
Agent to agent.
Yes. So there's a couple different protocols around there. MCP obviously one of the most popular. I don't think it's. I haven't gone too deep in the weeds in terms of like the protocol differences, but I don't think it changes much in terms of whether a human calls it or an agent calls it. I think everyone's looking for that same observability and control. It's just a matter of whether it's event-driven via human clicking enter or an agent forwarding on the request.
I felt the A2A protocol was a clean implementation, but because MCPs gained so much popularity and they've added elicitations and sampling within the MCP protocol itself, I'm imagining more teams start to offer agents as an MCP tool call, which just makes sense because now MCPs can call other MCPs, and that just becomes the way agents communicate with each other as well. So that could be potentially how it evolves. It might not be as clean in the beginning because an agent is supposed to make tool calls, but the tool call is also an agent in itself. How does it delegate back? But I'm sure these constructs will just evolve and clean up over time because end of the day, as responses API is now an agentic API. It's not, it's an agent that you're calling. And you can easily map a responses API behind an MCP tool for this. So there's a lot of these architecture patterns that will evolve. But I would bet on MCP winning this because of its wide adoption across the provider network and across enterprises as well.
And I think I read somewhere maybe the MCP can call an agent too. So that's kind of the different architecture that is being explored right now. In my mind, like now how I'm looking at we can build is like looking at there could be multiple agentic frameworks within the organization. We cannot just stick to one. And the reason is like the bigger organizations, they're already set up for multiple platforms, and those platforms are already offering their own AI platform services. So, for example, SAP is doing its own, Salesforce is doing its own, Snowflake is doing its own, and maybe all that, right? So, it will be very difficult to bring all of them out of their platform. There might be some reason to stick to their platform itself. Not like we probably want to restrict the development, how much we want to do, we need to have a policy for that. But when they start building it, then we need a way to bring all those agents to talk to each other. So there might be another application at the high level, at the enterprise level, that might want to talk to an agent running on Snowflake, get the output and try to get the data from SAP, and then do something with the data. Maybe just comparing the data, for example, right? So I'm seeing it could happen at this layer. It's very simple architecture. And then MCP calls will happen for certain tools that you have built or certain other services that you want to access in between. So that's the simplest architecture. But it's going to be multiple frameworks, multiple agents running across. I'm seeing like maybe I'm going to have agents per domain, right? So if you look at your business domain in your organization, all domains will have their own agents, multiple agents. But from the enterprise level, they all need to talk to each other. So A2A is a good protocol where you can have agents to talk to each other, and MCP is that is the way to empower your agents to work better.
But A2A and MCP are they're converging so quickly in their spec. It'll be interesting if they start competing because you also have now ACP
from IBM.
Yeah, ACP is also come up. So yeah, it'll be interesting. This will be a good fight for the next 6 months before we just standardize on how agents call other agents, because the latest research papers are coming out saying, oh, multi-agent systems don't work. So we're probably going through that trough of, oh, this doesn't work, and then there'll be some sanity on how they work together. But that's the phase we're in right now.
Awesome. Yeah, please go ahead.
So, have you guys worked on real-time using different providers with some user events? I'm not asking like each tool can connect to different agents, and I just like the same thing. Have you guys worked on what frameworks, what applications?
So generally, the reasons you would do this is for canary testing or real-time A/B testing, where you're running the same prompt through multiple providers or multiple models. The reason to do it would be only like you're testing a newer version of something and you want to make sure nothing breaks. And there's like, if you're doing it on the SDK level, then you can just make parallel requests. If you're doing it through an AI gateway, then the gateway will just fork the request and run both of them in parallel. So, I mean, depends on how you want to make it work. But in production, when you're doing a canary test or a A/B test, then you would delegate it to the gateway to fork your requests and then return it.
If not canary test in production, what response would you
You get both the responses back, and then the application will need to handle those two responses. So what's the use case where you would want to fork requests into two different providers?
So sometimes I see that ChatGPT so is there any way like this set of user prompt might this other might
Yeah.
is there anything that's out there?
So I think what you're talking about is LLMs as judges. So what you do is you run them through multiple LLMs and then use a judge LLM to figure out what was the best response and then maybe serve that out to the user. And in many cases you might also, if you've seen ChatGPT, they serve 2 responses to you and ask you to choose which one is better. So that's them collecting data to figure out which model is performing better for which use case. I think these are all custom implementations right now, where if you're building an application, you could either leave that choice to the end user, or you could use a third LLM decide which LLM's response was better and then choose that.
But a far more common implementation that we've seen is you would do all of this before going to production, like you would use some sort of an eval framework where you would have your golden data set, you would prompt something, send it to 10 providers, compare it with that golden data set or any other maybe guardrails or something, or figure out the winner and use that winner only in production. And then you can have some sort of an A/B test going on if there's a new model or you want to try out a new provider, maybe tweak something in the prompt. Then do that, just 5% traffic to that new configuration, 95% goes there, and you can keep switching these and keep improving the performance overall. I mean, that's the more common thing at least we see, but what Rohit mentioned, can send multiple and use a third LLM or a model as a judge, define your success criteria, and then it's going to give you a winner. That obviously works. It also adds like a double latency, because first you're waiting for all the LLMs to respond back, then you have to make another LLM call, wait for its response, and then return the answer to the client.
There's a latency, I think the cost is also.
Yes. Awesome. Are there any more questions? Yeah. Sorry, I think we're gonna wrap up the panel. I think you guys can also move around freely.
Yeah.
There's just no point sitting there. And we are here till 8. Feel free to network, ask questions to any one of us. Please have some snacks, beverages, pick up some snacks from here. But yeah, I think that's much better rather than just you folks having to sit there. And,
We can come closer and
yeah.
just chat.
Awesome. No, thank you everyone.